A revolution is the struggle to the death between the future and the past. These were some of the first words spoken by Fidel Castro in the newly established communist Cuba. Fidel Castro has left Cuba as a poor country still oppressed under the communist system, but has implemented massive reforms in healthcare and education that have improved the lives of the people and set Cuba on a path that could lead it to future success. Fidel Castro was born on August 13, 1926 in Barran, Cuba, to the name Fidel Alejandro Castro Ruiz. He was born into the third of 6 children to a wealthy sugarcane farmer. Fidel Castro lived a rich lifestyle despite the poverty that surrounded him. He was a very intelligent child, but he preferred to follow his baseball career. He eventually realized that his intelligence should not be taken for granted, and he took his talents to the University of Havana to study law. He quickly became interested in the ideas of socialism and Cuban nationalism. After his graduation, he joined the Cuban People's Party and was going to represent them in a seat in the House of Representatives. However, before he was able to run, General Fulgencio Batista, with the support of the United States, overthrew the government and canceled elections. In reaction to this, Castro attempted to resolve the crisis legally, but was met with a dead end. This was the start of his revolution and sparked tension between America and Castro. His first organized attack against the totalitarian government was a suicide attack with 160 soldiers on the Moncada military barracks in 1953. As per usual, his plan failed and most of his men died while the rest fled. Fidel Castro was captured and arrested. His life could have been over after he had been sentenced to 15 years in prison. However, he was able to escape to Mexico due to political amnesty. In Mexico, he raised awareness about Batista's dictatorship and eventually organized an army of Cuban exiles to take part in his 26th of July movement. 3 years after his arrest, he returned to Cuba with an army of 81 men. Upon his return, Cuba became a war zone. His initial attack on the shore of his landing was another poor strike. Like a broken record, most of his men were killed except for Castro, his brother, and Che Guevara. Once he was in Cuba, he began to fight a guerrilla war against Batista. Unlike his pathetic raids in the past, Castro's amateur army was picking up speed after defeating Batista's troops in multiple battles. After only a month, Batista fled the country. Castro had been able to hold off a professional 30,000-man army with an inexperienced group of 1,000 men. After Castro's overthrow of Batista, Castro established friendly relations with the Soviet Union, partly due to the fact that Batista was installed by Americans. The United States became very alarmed and cautious and attempted to remove Castro from power, but failed. The unsuccessful attempts include assassinations, an economic blockade, and a counter-revolution known as the Bay of Pigs invasion. Dwight D. Eisenhower feared failure of the invasion, so John F. Kennedy was left to decide. Kennedy was much more hostile towards Cuba. He described Cuba as America's most glaring failure. He felt Cuba endangered the whole Western Hemisphere due to his fear of Fidel Castro exporting his revolution to other countries. Under Kennedy, America began to run the Cuban Project. Also known as Operation Mongoose, the CIA led the covert effort to topple the newly established communist Cuba. The operation included 33 different plans to convert Cuba into a Western-oriented country, such as destroying its sugar crops, using special forces to infiltrate the country, or assassinating Fidel Castro. Some famous assassination ideas include installing salts in his clothes to make his beard fall out, or filling his Cuban cigars with toxins. Fidel is assumed to have survived these attempts, which has led to further U.S. aggression towards Cuba. It has also pushed them to extensive action. The United States worked with the CIA and raised 1,400 anti-Castro Cuban exiles. Trained by the CIA, the exiles would invade the island with air support, hoping to trigger a counter-revolution that would overthrow Castro. If the counter-revolution failed, the United States would launch a guerrilla campaign. The landing ground, known as the Bay of Pigs, only led to a swamp. Castro's forces defended the invasion well and had popular support. There was no mass rising, and the Cuban exiles surrendered. The Cuban Missile Crisis began when Nikita Khrushchev spoke of planting nuclear weapons in Cuba. Khrushchev justified this as a response to the U.S. putting missiles in Turkey. Before the conflict escalated, an American plane spotted the missile base. President John F. Kennedy demanded the removal of the missiles. Kennedy and Khrushchev agreed that if the U.S. did not invade Cuba, then the missiles would be removed. Kennedy also decided to remove the U.S. missiles from Turkey. However, Castro was aggravated because he was left out of the negotiations. He felt manipulated and not as involved in this crucial decision as he should have been. The United States ended relations with Cuba after this issue. Once taking power, Castro nationalized U.S. businesses, which led to the end of diplomatic relations between Cuba and the United States. An embargo was established that still exists today. Castro established several reforms such as providing electricity to the countryside, abolishing legal discrimination, and constructing schools and hospitals. Cuba uses 30% of its land in order to grow crops. Food grown in Cuba is always organic and non-GMO, providing the citizens the best options for healthy produce. However, a downside to non-GMO food is that it is harder to grow. Castro is assuring the health of his citizens at a high risk of famine. However, there have been no notable famines throughout Castro's communist rule. Fidel Castro focused on essential social services. Article 50 of the Cuban Constitution mandates the right to health protection and care for all people. This was achieved by establishing a medical service network, polyclinics, hospitals, and specialized treatment centers. People are provided free dental care and vaccinations in order to prevent the spread of disease. Cuba has the highest life expectancy in its region, with the average citizen living to 78 years old. Also, the number of physicians per 1,000 people is nearly double that of the United States. Castro developed a healthcare system that has become a model for the world. Article 51 of the Constitution guaranteed free universal education. It states that this right is guaranteed by the extensive and free system of schools, part-time boarding schools and scholarships in all types and at all levels of education. The schools in Cuba are excellent and illiteracy has been eliminated from their society. The students in Cuba have scores on math and literature that are twice as high as any other Latin American or Caribbean country. This educated population also shows the society's desire for change, considering the people of Cuba are still very poor. The frustrated middle class of engineers, doctors, technicians, and teachers are anxious to abandon this collectivism due to the fact that they have close to no chance of improving their current situation. Castro's education reforms that have led to an educated middle class have given Cuba the ability to form a democracy in the future. Despite the reforms that benefited Cuba, Castro also suppressed any opponents of him. He banned newspapers that opposed him, jailed political opponents, and made no move towards elections. Castro limited the amount of land each person could own, banned privately owned businesses, and controlled housing and food shortages. Due to the strict U.S. embargo, Castro was forced to condense his exports to select countries. The Soviet Union was a prime consumer for Castro's goods, where they bought sugar for 5 times the normal price. Cuba was heavily dependent on the USSR consumption until its collapse. The USSR may have been the lifeline of Castro's Cuba and kept them from fully capsizing after trade restrictions. The limited economic opportunities that followed the embargo and reforms forced many Cuban workers to migrate to the United States. From 1960 to 1980, Castro supported guerrilla movements with financial and military support to Africa and Latin America. Aside from the United States, Cuba began to stabilize relations with many countries over time. The communist government controlled by Castro has led to a majority of the population being employed and very few homeless people. Since Castro has gained control of the country, he has single-handedly reformed the nation and improved the well-being of the individuals. However, communism has produced a much more negative than positive effect on Cuba. Due to communism in Cuba, the population as a whole is still poor. The people are equal, but are all in similar situations in which they can only spend their money on necessities. The Cubans must live simple lives contained by strict communist law. Although the reforms introduced by Castro have improved life overall, the quality of living still isn't very high. The reforms that Castro initiated during his control of Cuba have significantly improved the life of Cubans from prior to the revolution. However, the country is still quite poor and is held back by communism. Although Castro established communism in Cuba, he ruled almost as an authoritarian dictator. Due to this system of government, Cuba has been unable to grow their economy. The embargo with the U.S. has denied Cuba of a crucial trading partner which could have helped their economy. Also, the fall of the Soviet Union left Cuba with no consumer for their exports. They are also isolated from the rest of the world. A successful economy in the modern world is a result of global trade and communication, which is lacking in Cuba. A change from communism is needed if the Cuban government wants to improve the economy. Fidel Castro's brother Raul Castro is currently the leader of Cuba. Castro's presence is currently minuscule in the Cuban government due to his declining health. Overall, his actions and reforms from the 60s are still impactful and relevant to the modern world and have set a foundation for future success in Cuba.